I would like to ask Professor Poornima Prabhakaran to have a look at the impact of climate change on public health in India. And she's an Indian-trained physician with a postgraduate and doctoral training in the UK and Canada. So she travels the world. She currently serves as additional professor, head environmental health, and deputy director of the Center for Environmental Health at the Public Health Foundation of India. And she also leads work in engaging health sector leadership for environmental issues across India. She currently is chair of the research subgroup with the CSO Working Group on Climate Change and Health, co-chaired by the WHO and Global Climate and Health Alliance, where she is a member of the board. And, of course, a member of the inaugural steering group of the Health and Climate Network hosted by the Wellcome Trust. And Professor Prabhakaran, will you represent India in Glasgow?
Hello, Dr. Brand. That's a tall order. I will not be representing India. I will probably try to represent the health voice from India. I'm hoping to be there for sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Let me start by bringing my greetings from the Center for Environmental Health at the Public Health Foundation of India to all the esteemed dignitaries on the panel today and to the participants joining us from every part of India and elsewhere. I would also take a few seconds to convey my greetings, warm birthday greetings to Mr. Prasanna, and my thank you to Professor Rajni Prasanna for this endowment lecture series on a very topical issue, climate change. So I'm going to be using slides, maybe unlike the other panelists, but I wanted to bring home the fact today on the impacts of climate change on public health in India. I'd like to say thanks to Professor Henry Falk, because much of what he laid out so beautifully also rings true in India. But let me start with this issue of the ecosystem restoration. On June 5th, 2021, the UN declared a decade of action on ecosystem restoration, 2021 to 2030. And why I'd like to start with this is because it relates very much to the topic that we are talking about today on the changing climate and its impact on human health. So just to bring us all onto the same page, I understand there are a lot of students here, but very well-equipped students I know were studying in Mahe and elsewhere. But just when we're talking about ecosystem, it includes all forms of living organisms, people, animals, plants, and their interactions with each other and their surroundings. So nature, as well as the man-made systems, what we call man-made are the anthropogenic systems. And what has been happening of late is a degradation of these ecosystems and blurring of those boundaries between the human and the animal and the plant systems. And this has caused changes in our natural resources, be that air, the water, the soil, or even our built environments. And that is leading to depletion of our natural resources, but also to the pollution of those limited resources. The emergence of COVID-19 in the last year and a half also is an example of how disastrous these consequences can be, the blurring of ecosystems. So what it also has led to is changing conditions in our temperature, in our rainfall, in the sea levels in our country and across the world. And this has been responsible for the acute climate events that Dr. Henry Falk just alluded to. We have more of heat waves, we have floods, we have storms, we have droughts, cyclones, and for people here in India, deteriorating air quality, all of which constitute the phenomenon of climate change. Why are we talking about climate change? The public health community. Why should we be concerned? It is stated as the biggest public health challenge of the 21st century. But while it is seen as a challenge, it also is said to be the biggest public health opportunity of the 21st century, because we know the problem and we know how to deal with it. There is increasing evidence and research on the public health impacts of climate change, and we have the ammunition to actually deal with it. It's the knowledge that needs to be translated into action. I wanted to draw your attention for a second to this graphic. This is from the Lancet report of 2009, and the top half of this graphic is depicting the carbon emissions. So all of us are familiar with the greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is one of the major ones, apart from methane, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and the fluorocarbons, which are responsible for the global warming. And in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, this graphic, the first half, the top half, actually depicts from where the carbon emissions are coming mostly from. And the size of the different regions of the world depicts who is most responsible. So you can see that it's mostly the developed countries of the world that have in the past contributed to carbon dioxide emissions. But look at the lower half of this graphic. This refers to the health consequences of climate change. And here you can see the stark difference. It is really the developing countries and who are the most vulnerable to the health consequences of climate change. And this is something that we all would like to note in terms of where the resources need to go in terms of addressing the impacts of climate change. I won't spend too much time on this slide because Dr. Henry Falk has so beautifully already alluded to the fact that it is the rising temperature, extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and increasing carbon dioxide levels that lead to impacts on climate change, on human health. And this could vary from environmental degradation, degraded living conditions, enhancing social inequities, access to healthcare, but also a range of conditions from changes in vector ecology, climatic conditions that become more favorable for the transfer of vector-borne diseases. There's also deteriorating quality of air, water, and all of these lead to various range of health impacts. It also leads to forced migration. Acute climate events causes people to migrate from their regular homes, and this can lead to civil conflict and mental health impacts. And the implications of climate change for a country like India cannot be understated. It is among the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. And this is again just a summary of that slide. We have impacts ranging from the impacts of heat waves, vector-borne diseases, exacerbated air pollution, and impacts on agriculture and waterborne diseases. So between 1901 and 2007, apparently the surface temperature in India has increased more than 0.5 degrees. It seems like a small amount, but it means that with that increase in temperature, it has brought with it a lot of changes in climatic conditions, and that has resulted in the health burden that we are going to see, which is imminent in the coming years. And there's predictions, unfortunately, for further increases in the temperature. So somewhere in the range of 2.2 to 5.5 degrees rise in temperature in northern, central, and western India by the end of the 21st century is what is predicted. And just to put that in perspective, if we talk in absolute numbers, there were an additional 40 million heat wave exposure events in India in 1 year, 2016, as compared to just 4 years ago in 2012. And that has led to a lot of health burden. Even if we talk about the cities, look at this map where we're talking about what the concept of heat island effects. With increasing urbanization, the concretization that we see around us, this is showing the increase in heat, in temperature in some of the metro cities. And this ranges anywhere from 3 to 12 degrees. So a recent World Bank report has pegged that India is probably the leading country in terms of negative impacts from climate change, both in terms of health, but also the economic costs for climate change. And the figure that they put it at is that every additional ton of carbon dioxide costs India to 84 US dollars. And that is ahead of US. Just to put it in perspective, US, the figure is 48, about half of what India loses, and Saudi Arabia at 47 US dollars. So really, the impacts of climate change on India cannot be understated. In terms of health effects of heat, since that's what we'd like to focus on for this audience, it can range from heat exhaustion, heat stroke, cerebrovascular events, brain stroke, circulatory failure, renal failure because of acute dehydration events, exacerbation of pulmonary disease. And what is important to note is that it's the extremes of age, the infants and young children and the older population that are most vulnerable to the heat effects. I wanted to highlight this event that happened in Ahmedabad, a city in Gujarat, in 2010, When this figure actually shows the deaths in Ahmedabad in May 2010, and this on the left side, the axis shows the temperature. Temperatures during May 2010 in Ahmedabad had touched something like 47 to 48 degrees Celsius. And within 1 week, May 20th to 27th, there were 800 excess deaths in this city. So this made the city sit up and take notice. And we have actually the Indian Institute of Public Health, our campus in Gandhinagar in Gujarat, which sat up and took notice of this and evolved what was the first successful heat action plan for India, which is now world renowned, and it is now being scaled up in other cities of the country. This is a classic example of intersectoral coordination to handle an acute climate event. So the heat action plan brought together not just public health practitioners, but also city level actors in the form of, the traffic police, the municipal actors, urban local bodies, the exposure scientists who worked on climate change issues. And the heat action plan kicks into place every year around just before the summer, so that there's a very concerted and coordinated response to address heat wave by preventive actions. And this has been successfully shown to reduce mortality year after year. And we now have successful heat action plans in other cities taking after this model. Another example here of heat wave mortality spiking in the state of Orissa. So Orissa also has its own heat action plan now. So this is an issue which is being taken up as well by the government under its National Program for Climate Change and Health. The heat action plans are being scaled up across the board. Moving on to the other aspect of change in vector-borne diseases. This is another impact of climate change. The climatic conditions have become more and more favorable for the spread of vector-borne diseases. This is an image showing the global spread of vector-borne diseases, in particular for the mosquito-borne diseases. This is for dengue. You can see that the hotspots are lying mostly in this part of the world as well as in Latin America. So India is definitely one of the hotspots for dengue. And this picture actually shows you how the disease has spread not only in the parts of the states where it was prominent earlier, it is spreading to the northeastern states of India as well. These are graphs that show comparisons of dengue prevalence in states like Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, all northeastern states, which never had this disease before. There's a spike in the occurrence of dengue in all these states. And this is because of favorable climatic conditions for the vector, the mosquito, as well as change in the extrinsic incubation periods, which means the parasite, the disease agent is able to rapidly replicate in these states as well. Similar situation for malaria. Malaria is now spreading in India to all the states in the north and northeast, including Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram, states that had not seen malaria before. There's a longer transmission window. We are seeing malaria not just during the monsoon seasons, which are traditionally known to host harbor vector-borne, mosquito-borne diseases. It's all the transmission period has become now somewhere between 10 to 12 months, really like right through the year, you can see cases of malaria. Chikungunya was also mentioned by Professor Henry Falk. This is another mosquito-borne disease that has shown changing patterns as a result of changing climatic conditions. States, again, in the Northeast who have not seen this condition are beginning to see more and more cases of this debilitating disease. What about water? I wanted to allude to this other resource. India is among the water-stressed countries of the world. So there is an index of per capita water per individual. And if we are less than 1,000 cubic meters per person per year, we are classified as a water-stressed country. And in India, we have an average of 1,600 cubic meters of water per year. So in a climate changing situation, we are also seeing more and more inefficiency in the water resources, and those depleting water resources are often polluted. So what it means in terms of waterborne diseases for the Indian population is only easy to imagine. Moving on to the nutrition lens, again, something that Professor Henry Falk alluded to, India is an agrarian economy. We largely still are dependent on our agriculture sector for our livelihoods. A big part of our population is still using agriculture as their source of livelihood. And with the changing climate and global warming, 40% of the land surface will be experiencing altered climates. And in India, for an agricultural economy, this is going to impact not just our crop production in terms of quantum of crops that are produced, all the staple crops, rice, wheat, maize, sorghum, bajra. There's going to be like a 2% annual decrease in the production of the crops. And so in terms of food security, India is going to be imperiled in the coming years. It's not just the food security, it's also the nutrient content of the crops. So increasing temperature impacts the rates of crop maturation. So with the rapid maturation that occurs with increasing temperature, the nutrient content of crops changes. So again, in a country that is still in the demographic transition, facing not just nutrition-related disorders, but also the other extreme of the malnutrition spectrum, we are also seeing obesity and overweight. So if the crop production is going to decrease, people are going to transition off to the processed foods, and then we will see what is now labeled as the global syndemic, which is undernutrition, overnutrition, and climate change, the three pandemics together, and which have been labeled as the global syndemic. 1 second to just think about the livestock breeding. So livestock breeding actually contributes to methane emissions, another gas that is responsible for climate change. And livestock breeding, we have known also to be responsible for pandemics, including the present one. And this can kind of interact to also affect our resources and our ecosystems, the food as well as the water systems. I mentioned earlier about climate change and conflict. So as and when we face acute climate events, people are forced to move from their original homes, and this leads to conflict in terms of access to food, access to homes and livelihoods, as well as access to healthcare. So climate change and climate refugees is a concept that we are increasingly hearing about in the current times. And every 1 degree increase in temperature can increase the frequency of interpersonal conflict by about 2.5%. And not to forget the impacts on mental health. Post-traumatic stress disorders are being increasingly visualized across the board, across the country, just like it is in other parts of the world. I wanted to shift gears for the last few minutes for a systems lens on climate change and its impacts on health. And this is because we often hear about greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. We talk about increasing urbanization and emissions coming from different sectors, be that agriculture or the energy sector, the industry, transport, buildings. But what about the health sector? Does the health sector also contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? And do we need to care as public health people, as clinical practitioners, do we need to care about sectoral emissions from the health sector? The answer is actually yes, because the health sector, by virtue of its activities, also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a groundbreaking report that was released by the international organization Healthcare Without Harm in 2019, which showed us that healthcare together contributes to about 5% of the global emissions of carbon dioxide. And this, just to put that in perspective for you, equals emissions from about 500 coal-fired power plants. So the health sector's emissions are not minuscule. If all the health sector and the hospitals and health systems around the world were put together and ranked with countries, the health sector would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet. So certainly we need to sit up and take notice. And among the countries of the world, the top 10 emitters are the United States, China, European Union, Japan, and Russia among the top 5. But we also see here India, Brazil, South Korea, Canada, and Australia contributing to 2% of those emissions, while all other countries of the world are contributing to 25% of the emissions from the health sector. A snapshot of India's healthcare climate footprint. If we just take a quick look at what India contributes, it's about 39 metric tons of carbon dioxide, equivalent to about 10 coal-fired power plants emissions in 1 year. So really, if the answer in terms of what links climate change and healthcare in India, we have to recognize the impacts of climate change on health, the increasing burden of disease, as well as our own emissions. we have to prepare ourselves to face this disease burden that is going to be imminently increasing in our country. But we also need to reduce our own carbon footprint by changing our healthcare activities to more environment-friendly activities and grow ourselves into climate-friendly healthcare systems. The question is, are we prepared? And really, this is a wake-up call to all of us. We are really far from prepared in terms of developing our health systems to become climate-friendly. And we know that climate change strikes at the very core of health systems, and this is true across the world. This kind of scenario plays out in every part of the world. These are floods in Chennai in December 2015, and this is Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017. And this is wildfires in California. So across the board, climate change is an equalizer. When these acute climate events occur, they affect health systems and healthcare. So the 2015 Paris Agreement, which called for aligning healthcare and mobilizing the health sector as a leader, is a clarion call to every one of us. And we have started working in the dimension of climate smart healthcare in India for transformative action in this aspect of both adaptation and resilience and preparedness of the health sector to deal with the increased disease burden, but also to decarbonize our health systems. And guidance comes from very many documents. Dr. Brand, I'm just in the last two slides. I might have overshot my time. The World Bank has put out this guidance in 2017 with Healthcare Without Harm for 7 different dimensions of climate smart healthcare. And this was the first guidance that came out about overall system design of health systems, providing careful attention to building design and construction, investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency in health systems, paying attention to our waste management, sustainable transport and water consumption policies in our healthcare facilities, and procuring sustainably for all our pharmaceuticals, medical devices, food, and other products, and overall resilience strategies to deal with the increasing disease burden. WHO did its part as well and put out this guidance document in 2020 October, where it gives us guidance for developing climate resilient and environmentally sustainable healthcare facilities. This guidance focuses on interventions to deal with the health workforce capacity building, water sanitation, hygiene and healthcare waste management, sustainable energy services, but also to focus on infrastructure, technologies, and products that are sustainable. So across the board, ensuring that our health systems are both structurally resilient, but also functionally capacitated to deal with the impacts of climate change. Our framework that we are working with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in India actually allows us to work with both the public health facilities in India, but also private hospitals across India. And the framework that PHFI is developing to share with the Ministry of Health for its national program and implementation across India actually has all these pillars. We talk about site selection, where we are going to site our healthcare facilities based on the climate vulnerability of the region. We talk about sustainable buildings and infrastructure, how we address our natural resources, waste management, procurement, climate information services. And at the center of all of that is building our human resources and building climate leadership and climate financing, important aspects of building climate resilience in any country for that matter. And we were fortunate to have hosted a national conclave on climate change and the role of health sector to address climate change in India. And a white paper that we produced was presented to the then health minister for committing action to move India and its health sector to becoming climate smart health systems, which is really a smart strategy for future healthcare and protecting our ecosystems. And we cannot do this alone. The health sector has to work with other sectors, and therefore we commit to intersectoral coordination as key to this action. I'll end with this slide by saying we are not alone. Professor Helmut Brand mentioned the COP meeting in a month, less than a month from now, and Healthcare Without Harm is the official health partner of the UNFCCC, working with health systems around the world on this initiative called Race to Zero, which is committing global healthcare to commit to decarbonizing their health systems by 2050. And we are working with health systems in India to commit to this activity. Thank you so much, and I apologize if I overshot over there. Thank you, Dr. Brand.